It's 1859. A bearded abolitionist named John Brown arrives at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with 21 followers, a wagon full of rifles, and a plan. Step 1. Seize the federal arsenal. Step 2. Hand the weapons to enslaved people. Step 3. Massive uprising. Step 4. Slavery collapses across the South. Flawless. No notes. Small issue. Steps 2, 3, and 4 did not happen. Brown captured the arsenal. Then he stood in it, waiting for the uprising. The uprising did not RSVP. Local militia surrounded the building. United States Marines stormed it, commanded, incidentally, by a colonel named Robert E. Lee. Remember that name? Brown was tried, convicted of treason, and hanged. But before he died, he left the country one extremely uncomfortable message. This argument was not going to end with paperwork. To understand how America got here, we rewind. The United States had been expanding west for decades, and every single time it grabbed new land, politicians had to answer this same question. Will slavery be allowed there? No. Yes. No. Yes. Could we possibly discuss literally anything else? No. The North was going industrial. Factories, cities, railroads, paid labor. The South, especially the Deep South, built its entire economy on enslaved labor growing cotton. And cotton was absurdly profitable. It shipped to textile mills up north and in Europe and made plantation owners some of the wealthiest men alive. Southern politicians defended slavery with property rights, state sovereignty, and the Constitution. Abolitionists countered with a slightly stronger argument. Enslaved people were people. For decades, Congress tried to hold the country together with compromises. The Missouri Compromise drew a line across the map and tried to keep free states and slave states balanced. Congress: we fixed it. Map: you drew a line on me. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California free, but strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, which meant people who escaped slavery could be captured and dragged back even after reaching a free state. Which meant Northerners who had spent years ignoring slavery entirely were now legally required to participate in it. They were not thrilled. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Instead of Congress deciding, the settlers in each territory would simply vote on it. That sounds democratic. It was, right up until pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, formed two rival governments, burned each other's towns, and started killing each other. They named it Bleeding Kansas. Subtle. Then the Supreme Court showed up to help. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived with his owner in free territory and argued that this should make him free. The court said no. Then the court kept going. It declared that Black Americans could not be citizens at all and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in any territory. This decision was supposed to settle the debate forever. Instead, it poured gasoline on the debate, lit a match, dropped the match, and then threw in a second match for quality assurance. By 1860, the old party system was a corpse. A new party, the Republicans, ran on stopping slavery from spreading west. Their candidate was Abraham Lincoln, a very tall lawyer from Illinois with a gift for public speaking, a talent for folksy storytelling, and the face of a man who last slept properly in 1847. Lincoln was clear. He would not abolish slavery where it already existed. He would only stop it from spreading. To many white Southerners, this sounded like the opening credits of the end. Lincoln won the 1860 election without carrying a single state in the Deep South. South Carolina reviewed the results and said, "Cool, we're leaving." Leaving what? The country. You can do that? Great question. South Carolina seceded in December 1860. Then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. They formed the Confederate States of America and made Jefferson Davis president. And before anyone in the comments starts typing, Confederate leaders wrote down why they left, in their own founding documents. Protecting slavery was the entire point. The receipts exist. Meanwhile, the sitting president, James Buchanan, watched the country come apart from his desk. He believed secession was illegal. He also believed the federal government had no authority to do anything about it. So what's the plan, sir? Nothing. Nothing? I leave in March. Outstanding. Lincoln took office in March 1861 and inherited a country already split in half. Federal forts were still sitting inside Confederate territory. One of them was Fort Sumter, parked in the middle of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The Confederacy told the garrison to surrender. The garrison declined. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on the fort. The American Civil War had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, which immediately backfired because 4 more slave states joined the Confederacy: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. 4 slave states stayed in the Union: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Keeping those 4 loyal was critical. If Maryland flipped, Washington, D.C. would be completely surrounded. If Kentucky flipped, the Confederacy gained rivers, railroads, and a highway north. Lincoln reportedly said, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Respectfully, sir, priorities. Both sides assumed this would be over fast. The Union had more people, more factories, more railroads, more ships, and more money. The Confederacy had experienced officers, home terrain, and the enormous advantage of playing defense. The South didn't need to conquer the North. It only needed to survive until Northern voters lost interest. So naturally, everyone predicted a few months tops. First major battle, near Bull Run, Virginia. The Confederates called it Manassas because the 2 sides could not even agree on what to name the battles. This continues for the entire war. Enjoy. Civilians rode out from Washington to watch. Some brought picnic baskets. Because apparently, in 1861, a civil war was considered a fun day out with the family. At first, the Union pushed the Confederates back. Then Confederate reinforcements arrived. Then the Union line collapsed. Soldiers, civilians, horses, wagons, and several hundred deeply regretful picnickers all sprinted back toward Washington simultaneously. The battle made one thing clear: this was not going to be short. The Union settled on a strategy nicknamed the Anaconda Plan. The Navy blockades every southern port. The armies take the Mississippi River. The Confederacy gets cut in half and slowly squeezed. Why Anaconda? Because slowly crush everything until it stops moving didn't fit on the map. Out west, a fairly unknown Union general started taking Confederate forts. Name: Ulysses S. Grant. When the commander of Fort Donelson asked what surrender terms he would accept, Grant replied that the only terms available were immediate and unconditional surrender. The newspapers lost their minds. Ulysses S. Grant. U.S. Grant. Unconditional surrender Grant. Front page, go. Then came Shiloh. Confederate troops launched a surprise attack and nearly erased Grant's army. The Union held on by its fingernails, reinforcements arrived overnight, and the next morning Grant counterattacked and shoved the Confederates back. Cost: around 23,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. In 2 days. That's when Americans began to understand what this war actually was. The rifles had gotten better. Much better. Accurate at long range. The tactics had not. Generals were still marching men shoulder to shoulder across open fields. Modern weapons, Napoleonic tactics. You can do that math. In the East, Lincoln was hunting for a general who could actually beat the main Confederate army. He picked George McClellan. McClellan was genuinely excellent at organizing troops, training troops, building defenses, and making his army look magnificent. There was one activity he did not enjoy: fighting. He was also permanently convinced he was outnumbered. Always. By everyone. Regardless of evidence. "General, you have more men than they do." That is exactly what they want us to think. We counted them. Send more men. McClellan launched a campaign to capture Richmond, got close, then stopped to request reinforcements. Robert E. Lee took command of the city's defense and attacked him for a week straight until McClellan withdrew. Lee then decided the best defense was invading Maryland. September 1862, Antietam Creek. For one day, the 2 armies fought through a cornfield, a patch of woods, a sunken road, and a bridge. By sundown, more than 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. It is still the bloodiest single day in American history. Lee pulled back to Virginia. Militarily, it was roughly a draw. Politically, Lincoln called it a victory because he had been sitting on something, waiting for any Union success at all. 5 days later, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. As of January 1, 1863, enslaved people in territories still in rebellion would be declared free. Now the fine print. It did not free everyone. It didn't apply to the loyal border states, and it could not be enforced anywhere Confederate armies still stood. But it changed what the war was for. The Union was no longer fighting only to put the country back together. It was now officially fighting against slavery. It also quietly destroyed the Confederacy's foreign policy. Britain and France had been weighing support. Now supporting the South meant publicly backing a nation fighting to preserve slavery. Both governments suddenly remembered they had other commitments. Black Americans became central to the Union war effort. Enslaved people escaped to Union lines, carried intelligence, worked as laborers, guided armies through country no Northern officer knew, and enlisted. Nearly 180,000 black men served in the Union Army. Thousands more served in the Navy. They served for lower pay. They faced discrimination inside their own army, and if captured, they faced execution or re-enslavement instead of being treated as prisoners of war. They enlisted anyway. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry became the most famous of these regiments. It led an assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The attack failed, and the casualties were severe, but it permanently destroyed the racist claim that black soldiers would not fight. Meanwhile, the Confederacy was quietly coming apart. The blockade strangled trade. Food prices exploded. Factories couldn't produce enough weapons. Confederate currency became decorative, and as more white Southern men left for the army, the farms and plantations lost control of their workforce because enslaved people escaped, slowed work to a crawl, and passed information to Union troops. The Confederacy's labor system was also its largest internal threat. In 1863, Lee invaded the North again, this time Pennsylvania. The two armies collided outside a small town called Gettysburg. 3 days. Day 1. Confederates pushed Union troops back through the town. The Union dug in on the hills to the south, which, for the record, is the best real estate in the history of warfare. Day 2. Lee attacked both ends of the Union line. Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, Cemetery Hill. The line held. Day 3. Lee decided to punch straight up the middle. Around 12,500 Confederate soldiers walked across nearly a mile of open ground toward the center of the Union position. Union artillery opened up, then Union rifles. The formation was shredded. A handful reached the Union line. None of them broke it. The survivors walked back. It's remembered as Pickett's Charge. Lee's invasion of the North was finished. His army returned to Virginia and never attempted anything that size again. And the day after Gettysburg ended, on the other side of the country, Grant captured Vicksburg. Vicksburg controlled the Mississippi River. With it gone, the Union owned the entire river, and Texas, Arkansas, and most of Louisiana were cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. 2 days, 2 hammer blows, entire war reoriented. Later that year, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the Union dead. The main speaker talked for about 2 hours. Lincoln talked for about 2 minutes. He said the war was a test of whether a nation founded on liberty and equality could actually survive. Then he sat down, convinced he had bombed. It became the most famous speech in American history. So, decent outcome. In 1864, Lincoln handed Grant command of every Union army. Grant understood the ugly arithmetic. The Union could replace men, weapons, and supplies. The Confederacy could not. So he ordered attacks everywhere at once and personally rode with the Army of the Potomac to hunt Lee down. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. The casualties were staggering, and newspapers started calling Grant a butcher. But here is what made Grant different from every Union general before him. After each brutal battle, he did not retreat. He kept moving south. Eventually, he pinned Lee into the trenches around Petersburg and Richmond and simply refused to leave. At the same time, William Tecumseh Sherman was cutting through Georgia. Sherman took Atlanta in September 1864, which handed Lincoln re-election against, of all people, George McClellan, his own former general. Awkward. After Atlanta, Sherman marched for Savannah, destroying railways, warehouses, factories, and anything else feeding the Confederate war effort. His men heated railroad rails until they were soft and bent them around trees. They called them Sherman's neckties, because apparently even infrastructure demolition needed branding. Sherman's march proved something bigger than the damage. The Confederate government could no longer protect its own territory. Thousands of enslaved people followed his army out and claimed their freedom, often straight into hunger, homelessness, and violence, with nothing waiting for them on the other side. By early 1865, the Confederacy was finished, and everyone knew it. Armies shrinking, cities out of food, desertion everywhere. Union forces finally cracked the Petersburg defenses. Richmond fell days later. Lee's army fled west, looking for food and another army to join. Grant did not allow that. Union troops cut off every escape route. Confederate soldiers were exhausted, starving, surrounded, and nearly out of ammunition. On April 9, 1865, Lee met Grant in a house at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Lee arrived in a spotless dress uniform. Grant arrived in a muddy soldier's coat because his luggage hadn't caught up. They chatted briefly about the Mexican-American War, like two guys running into each other at a hardware store. Then they discussed surrender. Grant's terms were remarkably gentle. Confederate soldiers could go home. Officers kept their sidearms. Anyone who owned a horse could take it for spring planting. The Army of Northern Virginia surrendered. The remaining Confederate armies followed. The war was effectively over. 5 days later, Lincoln went to see a play at Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth, an actor, a Confederate sympathizer, and a man with a deeply unearned sense of destiny, walked into the presidential box and shot him. Lincoln died the following morning. The man who held the Union together and made emancipation the purpose of the war never got to run the piece. That mattered enormously. Final numbers: roughly 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers dead. Hundreds of thousands more wounded. Cities, farms, railways, and industries across the South destroyed. And around 4 million enslaved people were free. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. Remember that exception. It gets used. The 14th established birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th banned denying the vote because of race. During Reconstruction, Black Americans voted, held political office, founded schools, built churches, started businesses, and searched for family members who had been sold away years earlier. That last one usually gets a single sentence in a textbook. And all of it was met with organized terror. White supremacist groups used violence to drive Black Americans out of public life. Southern legislatures wrote discriminatory laws, and eventually, the federal government stopped enforcing the amendments it had just passed. Most of the promises of Reconstruction were simply abandoned. So, the Union survived. Slavery was abolished. But the fight over citizenship, racial equality, federal authority, and what freedom actually means did not end at Appomattox. It just entered the next chapter. And you can still see that chapter in the United States today.